You read the article from Philip Gordon about the end of the Bush Revolution, and you watched that video. Unger, I think his name was, and I can't remember the name of the book that it was, but again, another explanation about why the neocons came to dominate the George W. Bush administration and why they were not very successful. The answer, by the way, for why they were not successful for both of those authors is just the idea that they didn't think neoconservatism worked. In fact, I don't know if you got that from the author on the Democracy Now! Video, but he clearly doesn't think it worked. He thinks it's very dangerous. He thinks blah, blah, blah. And a realist would definitely think it's dangerous. A liberal internationalist would think it's dangerous. Honestly, if you're not a neocon, neoconservatism doesn't really ring very true. Maybe offensive realists are going to be okay with it, but only to the extent that you talk about getting power. Once you start talking about how you use the power, they're not on board. So the question, I just want to walk kind of through what Philip Gordon said. We're just going to ask a couple questions here, but also sort of fill in some blanks. Why did the neocons dominate foreign policy in W's first term? If you were following along from George H.W. Bush, George H.W. Bush was a defensive realist. To the extent that you would think that George W. Bush is his kid, you would think maybe he's going to be defensive realist too, and he doesn't end up being that way. Now, what we do know is when W came in, he might not have been a hardcore neocon. W, like a lot of the presidents we talked about, foreign policy was not his thing. He was the governor of Texas, and he was the owner or manager or something, general manager of I can't remember what it was, maybe he's the owner of the Texas Rangers baseball team. I mean, foreign policy was not his thing. So just like Clinton, just like Carter, he came in and was going to very much rely upon others to run the foreign policy. For W, though, obviously 9/11 happened and foreign policy came to dominate a lot of things, if not everything that he really did during his presidency, at least early on. So we know that he came to office and he had neocons and he had defensive realists definitely in his administration. Now, it turns out the neocons were better placed for whatever reason. Early on, the vice president, Dick Cheney, who is a neocon, when Dick Cheney was selected, George W. Bush really let Dick Cheney do a lot of the decision-making on foreign policy, which included who to bring in for foreign policy. And he brought in a lot of people that were neocons like him, both at sort of cabinet levels and all the way down. So when it came to those foreign policy meetings where they're sitting around the table, Cheney, having a lot more sort of say in these things, was able to construct the table in such a way that the neocon voice tended to dominate. And then, as it also sort of talked about in that video, what likely happened is after 9/11, the urgency of the matter was raised to a point where Bush had to be more involved with foreign policy. So who was sitting there instructing him on how to think about these things? The answer was almost certainly neocons again. So why did neocons dominate foreign policy? All that's one thing to say this. The other thing to say this is if George W. Bush would have stood up there and said, here's what we're going to do about this, and the American people would have said, that's ridiculous, then it would have just gone. Because the American people were very engaged in foreign policy after 9/11. So we could also ask the question, not just why did they dominate foreign policy in W's White House, but why did they dominate foreign policy in the U.S. during that first term? They really did. If you were in the United States in that time, for the most part, it wasn't a stupid idea. So let's talk about it. Number one, U.S. public felt very vulnerable after 9/11. And after an attack like that, it raises this sort of need to feel secure. Now, if I'm the average American citizen, I don't really know what that means. But here's what I do know, is that if the U.S. does nothing, sort of a defensive realist who might say, don't worry about it, at least it's not, a nuclear war, it's just, an attack, we'll be fine. The American people would have said, screw you. So U.S. had the strength to do something. And so with defensive realism, the whole conversation would be about avoiding the security dilemma. It's very unmotivating. Don't stir up the hornet's nest, just let them be. 9/11 stunk. We'll make sure 9/11 doesn't happen again, but don't worry about it. Just go on with your life. That just does not work out very well. What about liberal internationalism? That would sort of turn to international organizations to lead the way against 9/11. Well, many were unconvinced that they would act. And even if they did act, would they act in U.S. national security interest? So you have to do something. And the neocons had a plan that didn't involve avoiding a security dilemma or turning to the UN. The neocons had a ready-made plan on what to do, and that was democratization. Now, it wasn't exactly sold like democratization, but it was definitely get rid of the bad guys. The good guys will spring up, and if the good guys are there, they're not going to send people off to kill others in 9/11. Now you might say, well, states didn't do this. It was another group. Yeah, but the state is providing a safe haven. So if, for example, here's Afghanistan, and Al-Qaeda was operating out of Afghanistan, if that would have been a democracy, the Taliban's gone, then Al-Qaeda couldn't have operated from there, and 9/11 might not have happened. And that becomes the whole idea, is that democracy equals no terrorism. Freedom equals no terrorism. And so freedom must be expanded around the world. Now, here's the great thing about this. Not only is that a ready-made plan that they didn't have to cook up because they already had it. They've been thinking about this for decades and decades. It was doing something. It wasn't just sitting around. And it was incredibly optimistic. It was about creating a better world. And because you create a better world, you create a safer America. That's a win-win for the U.S. public. And so it's an easier thing to sell in this post-9/11 world, where sort of a hardcore neocon idea would have been a tough sell without 9/11. So then that begs the question. So that tells us why sort of in the first term of office, that's what happened. By 2006, when he's writing this article, and really 2005, the neocons are no longer dominant in W's administration. Now, there's a lot of ways we could talk about this, but let's just say here, what changed by 2005? A couple things changed. What changed, number one, was the U.S. public felt less vulnerable. There hadn't been another 9/11 since 2001. So 4 years had gone by, and you could make the argument that essentially the neocons or the Bush administration was too successful. They had created a situation, they had done so much to make sure another 9/11 didn't happen, that people started to believe 9/11, while not sort of it was a unique event, it could happen again, but we've done enough to make sure it didn't happen again. So do we really need to invest all this money and effort overseas, doing regime change, spreading freedom? Maybe not. The American people just felt less vulnerable by this point. And so we don't really need to do that neocon thing anymore. The other thing is the optimism of the neocon plan was spent in Iraq. That essentially we're going to go to Iraq, we're going to remove Saddam Hussein, the people of Iraq are going to come together in democracy, they're going to elect their leaders, it's going to be freedom, they're going to be pro-US, everything's going to be great, and that is clearly not what happened. By 2005, not only has a civil war broken out in Iraq, despite doing all the right things in terms of regime change, the U.S. was entangled in it. There was a higher likelihood of terrorist organizations operating out of Iraq than there was before we went into Iraq. And it was just kind of a mess. And so this idea that neoconservatism that essentially remove the bad guys, good guys will spring up, was kind of like, really? I'm not so sure anymore. So the neocons, a lot of the neocons sort of they stepped down from office, not because they were asked to per se, like Rumsfeld probably could have stuck around if he wanted to, Dick Cheney stuck around, but it was a harder sell to the American public to do the neocon stuff. So while there were still people who believed in neoconservatism in the Bush administration, it was harder to actually play that out, and there were actually new voices in there that were not neoconservative. Now, here's the warning that Philip Gordon makes, and I'm just going to throw this out there for you. The warning that he wants to make about this is this: neocons can make a comeback. And in fact, there have been many times since 2005 that people have argued that the neocons are coming back into power, into ascendancy. It was argued that that was happening in the Trump administration, though it's hard to see that. You can make an argument here or there that neocon ideas are making headway, but not. I was a little surprised when so many of you guys in this class early on were okay with neoconservatism. Just because there was a time not so long ago, even a few years ago, where neoconservatism was just considered like wrong. And clearly that doesn't always stay that way. Gordon argues that it can make a comeback if the U.S. public feels a new threat rising. Just saying, who knows? I know you don't fight coronavirus, but will the coronavirus and the economic downturn lead to other threats in the world that would require a neocon solution to them? The other is if that optimism returns. Now, for him, he was writing this in an era where George W. Bush said, I'm going to make a bet. I'm going to send a surge in. I'm going to send a bunch of new troops, U.S. troops, into Iraq and try and really get it right this time. And it actually turned out that it did work, and some of the optimism did return, but not enough to sort of counterweight the Iraq thing. So that is neoconservatism. We will see this again a couple times, but this was when it was sort of in its heyday. And then we're going to talk more about terrorism and counterterrorism next week. That's it. So that's week 2. I hope you guys enjoyed it. We're a third of the way done. We have 4 more weeks to go, and some of the Easters and some of that. So I will see you guys next week. Keep up the good work.